Dear participants of the SDG Global Festival for Action, dear panelists, welcome to this exchange on a new eco-social contract for people and the planet organized by UNRISD and the Green Economy Coalition. Calls for a new social contract to overcome recent crises are numerous and very diverse. We have heard voices from the Black Lives Matter movement, the UN Secretary General, the International Trade Union Congress, and the World Economic Forum, all demanding a new social contract. But it's not only the old social contract that is really broken, but also our relationship with nature. We need a recovery for both people and the planet from the pandemic and other systemic crises. So why is a new eco-social contract also vital in delivering on the SDGs? Because many have been left out or behind in our economies and societies, and it's time to ensure broad participation, dialogue, and consensus building across sectors and across society. A new eco-social contract will help us to rethink a number of relationships that have become so unbalanced, those between states and citizens, between people and nature, between capital and labor, between the global north and south, and in very unequal gender relations. A new eco-social contract will help us define rights and obligations and provide participation, trust, and also buy-in for transformative change that's really urgently needed for SDG implementation. A new eco-social contract is about institutions that are democratic and inclusive and which promote really gender environmental justice. And therefore we need, the action of citizen workers and movements calling for transformative policies and for action. Through this panel, we would like to bring different views on the new eco-social contract together. Over to Nashma.
Thank you so much, Isabel. So this panel discussion, as Isabel has mentioned, is a partnership between the GEC and UNRISD, really to bring together civil society, researcher, and social movement voices to discuss and debate the interlinked social and environmental agendas and this need for a new social contract. 2021 marks the start of the decade of action, really to step up our ambition to deliver on the SDGs. But for many of us, we are feeling that this is also the start of what I think might be the most consequential decade in our lifetime for human health and well-being, for the restoration of the freedom and dignity of people, for our common agenda of nature and climate, and for restarting and rebuilding our economies. And we really have the opportunity to turn around, to make this moment one that we can turn around and chart, a new pathway where we can work together for a more just and sustainable world, one where the trust between people and governments is restored. Our objectives today are really to recognize that the inequality, climate change, and biodiversity agendas are interlinked, and that they are really symptoms of the need for radical economic and social reform. I'm really looking forward to learn from the experiences of the people that we have brought together today, the incredible voices on the social and the green agendas, and to make the case for stronger engagement and alliances between the green and the social movements. It gives me great pleasure to introduce the panelists joining us. Firstly, from South Africa, Kumi Naidoo, founding chair of Africans Rising and a climate, environment and social justice activist. Welcome to you, Kumi. From Togo, program coordinator of climate and just transitions of the International Trade Union Confederation, Rhoda Boateng. It's a pleasure having you, Rhoda. Joining us from Thailand, Moida Navanat, human rights and environmental activist and indigenous peoples youth representative from the Karen community. Welcome to you, Moida. And from Geneva in Switzerland, Paul Ladd, who is the director of UNRISD. Welcome, Paul. This is such a pleasure for me to be having this conversation with all of you. I mean, I have had individual conversations, but to bring these voices together is a real privilege, and thank you to all of you for coming together today. Kumi, I'd really love to start the conversation with you and your reflections. We're beginning to see the social, climate and environmental justice agendas and movements actually standing together and calling, for a new social contract, calling for an opportunity for human dignity and well-being of people, for a safe planet, for this agenda to really start being linked, where are you seeing some of the most promising opportunities for this type of coalition emerging?
Thank you, Najma. I think the coming together of this diversity of forces that we are seeing happening, particularly over the last couple of years, is an expression that the existing social contract between our leaders and the people they govern is totally broken. In this moment of despair, given the multiple crises and the convergence of the crises that we have seen, is also a moment for optimism, as we see a level of joined up thinking and action across different sectors that we have not seen in the past. However, just to be clear, just to be careful that we don't engage in premature triumphalism, it is important to recognize, even though we are seeing more than we've ever seen before in terms of coordination, levels of unity in action, purpose, and approach, it is much less than what we need to be able to make the transitions that we need to. And I think that the appeal that the feminist movement has made for a long time through Kimberly Crenshaw and her work on intersectionality has never really been taken up by civil society as much as it should have been. And I am seeing it now happening on a scale that we've not seen before. And I hope that this happens substantially more, because it is a critical success factor for us to move to a world of greater justice and equity. And if we are serious about building a more inclusive social contract. I would like to just give you one example quickly, and that is, the racial justice movement and the climate movement have always been seen as being very, very far apart. In fact, when I was appointed head of Greenpeace and Dan Jones was appointed the Green Jobs Czar in the White House, there was an article that appeared about both of us entering this role entitled "Why It Is So Difficult to Be Black and Green at the Same Time." So these tensions have always been there, as you know. But in the midst of the pandemic, I had the opportunity to moderate a conversation between one of the founders of Extinction Rebellion and one of the leaders of Black Lives Matter. And this conversation found that actually they were coming more and more closer together, and they were finding common ground. And that even though they were not necessarily talking to each other as much as they should be, they found that actually they had much less in, of course, there are differences of strategy and so on, but they found that they had so much more in common than what they had in difference. And that is the challenge for us in this moment. How can civil society focus more on the larger number of things that unite us, and to respectfully disagree about the smaller number of things where we might have tactical and strategic differences about? And if I can just say something that Rhoda, my sister from Africans Rising, will appreciate. Following that session, Extinction Rebellion activists in the UK partnered with the Africans Rising for Justice, Peace and Dignity, the social Pan-African social movement in Africa, and did a banner drop in the Houses of Parliament, something that Africans Rising didn't have the capability to do. But and that banner drop was calling for recognition of the injustice of colonialism and slavery, and calling for redress. And I think that what we are seeing is people are crossing boundaries. And I think that it's a step in the right direction, but just be careful that we don't overstate how much of progress we have made. But this gives us confidence that in the moment that we're in, we can push for a very different narrative, for one that is not about incremental tinkering with a broken, unjust system where the social contract between leaders and people have been completely broken, but where we have a way forward where we can be pushing for structural and systemic changes that actually give us enduring and sustainable solutions to the many injustices that people face around the world. But thankfully, most people are recognizing that these injustices today are more and more overlapping, and therefore you need solutions that are more united, that is less siloed, that is more integrated, and so on. And for those reasons, challenging as this moment of history is, I am cautiously optimistic.
Thank you for those words to start us off, Kumi, and for sharing some of the examples of solidarity and showing where this is possible. If I can turn to Muida, Moida, I mean, your role as a youth leader, in an indigenous peoples group, just what are the key challenges as a leader that you've actually identified and tried to work through in your mission to advocate for social and environmental rights?
Thank you. So firstly, I would like to share about the first challenge of the indigenous people as the leader. What I see that first about the law and the policy does not recognize the indigenous people. Like the state gonna recognize us like a minority people, the hill tribe people not belong to the state or don't belong to the country, or even some people recognize us like illegal human. So of course, there are a lot of the discrimination issue happen in the indigenous people community. Secondly, of the challenge is the right to identity and participation in decision making, especially about the decision making or participate in the law and policy process. For example, in Thailand, in the national park law, that is directly affect to the indigenous people, but we have no chance to participate in the process. Like in the law just said that they have to remove the indigenous community from the forest or national park. That's the big challenge for the indigenous community. Thirdly, about the indigenous people in Thailand right to access information and participate in the development project process and has not been respected. So I would say that now I work with the indigenous people that's gonna have dam projects of my coal mining project gonna happen in their community. But in the process, even the law said that the project had to conduct EIA, have to conduct public hearing, but the indigenous people have no participation in the process. Even the state or even the company provide the public hearing. But in the public hearing, as you know that in the indigenous people, we have our own language. But in the public hearing, they use only the official language. I would say that many of the indigenous community could not speak official language. They have their own language. So when they provide the information that it doesn't no meaning for us. Lastly, for the right to land, environment, traditional livelihood, and access justice. I would say that indigenous people that who is the one protect the environment, protect the forest. But one day the state said that we have no right. We have no right in our ancestral land. So they try to remove us. What happened when our leader, when indigenous human rights defenders stand up to claim their rights? So one of our indigenous human rights defender forced disappearance. 2 years ago, we found that he is a godmother. Until now, we could not find it who is the one murderers. So it's a one challenge. It's four big challenge of indigenous people.
Thank you, Moida, for sharing that. And I think, I mean, you've just painted, a very stark picture of the fact that, indigenous people play such an important role in conserving, the natural world. They have the knowledge, the understanding, of the natural world, and an understanding that we need to get back, into our civilization if we are going to, as a planet, manage these challenges. But as you just mentioned, the challenge that other indigenous peoples face, in as you said, in Southeast Asia, in Africa, in Latin America, also, facing huge challenges, of illegal, activities taking place on their ancestral lands. And thank you for sharing that with us. And coming to you, Rhoda, I'm almost tempted to shift our question a bit towards social dialogue, because what really struck me from Moida's intervention was, this exclusion, this lack of voice, and really the need for social dialogue. But to look at the labor movement leadership, actually in this new social contract, Rhoda, and I think it's something really to be applauded, that the labor movement has been, at the forefront of the calls for a new social contract to put people and environment at the center of recovery and resilience. What does this mean for the world's 2 billion workers struggling in informal work? And as we both said, it's been so good for us to reconnect and to, reflect on our work and the challenges that we experience, in Africa and the contextual challenges that we have to actually create, decent, green jobs. So, Rhoda, your reflections?
Right. It's always great to connect with you, Najma, and I'm also very delighted to be here with you, Kumi, and to meet all of you esteemed panelists, as well as the audience. As I had been introduced, I work with the International Trade Union Confederation. Yes, over the past few years, we've been very active. We've been very loud about the need for a new social contract. In the build-up to the ILO centenary celebrations, which was in 2019, we deliberately, as a labor movement, pushed for this agenda to be incorporated in the new in the new centenary declaration. And coming out of the ILO that year, we're very happy to see that this was actually included, and somehow this has become a strong movement that's being pushed for, it's become an agenda that's being pushed for from various angles. And that's why I'm particularly excited about this conversation, because yes, for us as a labor movement, the whole question about, there's been several surveys that's been conducted by the ITUC, and all the surveys are pointing to a growing discontent, among citizens. There's been a high rise in protests, and even amidst the pandemic last year, we saw several protests from different parts of the world, in Africa, in the US, in different parts of the world. And this was also expressed the growing discontent, the mistrust in institutions, the mistrust in governance, and the mistrust in economic structures. And somehow this is all pushing or leading to the need for us to review the way we do things currently. And as a labor movement, the questions have even been more prominent on how do we ensure that in revisiting or in restructuring this whole new social contract, we take on board workers that are otherwise not formalized. So workers in the informal sector. And Najma, you did rightly mention there's about 2 billion workers across the world who fall within this sector. In Africa, we have countries that have huge levels, as huge as even 90% of their workforce within the informal sector. And these workers or this sector is characterized by precarious conditions. So we know that workers within these sectors do not have the rights to freedom of association. They do not have the rights to collective bargaining. There's very little or no social protection mechanisms at all, or provisions at all for workers found in this sector. And with the COVID-19 pandemic, we saw that most of these workers in this sector actually do or faced even worse, or the impact of COVID was even worse for workers in this sector. And so this is actually reinforcing the need for a new social contract. And for the labor movement, for us, what we're saying is that there's a need for us to begin to ensure that countries actually do take on board the questions around social protection provisions. And so we are calling on the need for a universal social protection floor, for instance. How can we ensure that there's a social protection fund that would be able to support the less marginalized, the less privileged, and the vulnerable populations in society, so that we would be able to address such issues such as healthcare, as we're seeing, or the absence of adequate healthcare, as we're seeing during this pandemic. A new social contract for us also is looking at questions around the universal basic income grants. And so how are we going to ensure that people who otherwise are not employed would be able to have access to some sort of support in countries where there are no opportunities for, or there are not adequate jobs to be for workers, for people to be able to fend for themselves and gain some livelihood. Essentially, we are also looking at the question of inclusivity, and I'm very happy that we have Moeda with us, who is also championing the cause and bringing on board the voices of indigenous workers. How do we ensure that in rebuilding this new social contract, actually thus include or bring on board all voices. So how do we bring on board marginalized voices? How do we ensure that we are not going to, it's not going to be a top-down, a top-down agenda anymore. We're going to have voices with us even during, discussions such as now. And I think it is very important that we consider or we look at the questions of inclusivity, which is very much linked to social dialogue, Nadma, as you did rightly mention. Most of our countries currently, especially if you look at Africa, we see that most countries do not really have or enjoy the rights to social dialogue. And here we're talking about bringing together tripartite structures, and so bringing together workers, employers, government to be able to develop policies as well as implement policies. And we have some good examples of some countries where social dialogue works, but then we know that in many countries, there's still the need for us to really build this. And these are some of the things we're pushing for. But lastly, and for me, most important, and especially for our dialogue, a new social contract should essentially deliver jobs. And here we're saying that it's important that in looking at job creation, we consider climate-friendly jobs. How do we ensure that in rebuilding, we are able to ensure that jobs that are created are green and decent? And these for us at the labor movement is at the heart of what a new social dialogue should look like, and essentially taking on board the concerns of everyone, including informal workers, as we see within our countries.
Thank you for your reflections, Rhoda. Listening to Kumi and then Moida and Rhoda, and turning now to you, Paul. We obviously seeing the labor movement, as Rhoda has alluded to. We've seen throughout this pandemic, citizens on the street, farmers blocking the entrance to major cities. If you consider what's happening, in India, people on the streets in Myanmar, and in some places, civil society getting a place at the table and being part of this moment that we have, to turn our economies and our societies around. And many of these movements are addressing not only the climate and environment breakdown, but as we've heard from the examples, they're addressing issues of race, class, intergenerational, and gender injustices. What role, in your view, can research institutes really play into providing the evidence-based knowledge to support civil society action and to craft, this route for a new social contract?
Thank you, Najma, and hello, everybody. I think my short answer is, research can be very important. It can play a strong role, but it's usually not enough. But just a few words on research first. Research and evidence-based knowledge can play a really important role in convincing policymakers, wherever they sit, to move towards better policies, practices, and investments. But it really matters how research is done, how it's promoted, and how it's received and perceived. UNRISD, the organisation I head, has long adopted an approach that emphasises co-production of research questions, of methodologies, and of research findings within a truly global research network that includes civil society. So I see the relationship between research institutes like UNRISD and civil society groups and movements around the world as very much symbiotic. We learn from research done by Southern grassroots organisations and NGOs and in Southern and global movements, and hopefully we also can provide support to that in a genuine way and act as a bridge to the rest of the UN for dialogues that take place there. And we also do some work with others in Geneva and in our Bonn office on research uptake, which focuses on how research is communicated and translated into capacity strengthening, into training, through which channels it's delivered, and ultimately whether it has traction on policy, practice, and outcomes. But coming back to where I started, research is important, but it's usually not enough. Whether it's even if it's optimally communicated, it can only get you so far. It's quite rare in the social sciences to have immediate traction on social policies, particularly when we want them to be transformative and not incremental, perhaps more so in the natural sciences. But we've seen how far even really strong evidence on climate and environmental destruction has got us in the debate globally. So there are limits all over. And in the end, it's mostly about politics. Politics is the filter that allows research to be heard or not, and politics is often the main barrier. Some people live in broadly democratic environments, but many others live under repressive and often violent regimes where freedom of expression is not respected as a political right, and research itself is politicized. Even in broadly democratic regimes where science is broadly supported, there are colossal battles between facts and misinformation. And ultimately, there are very many vested interests who may say that they support change, but they actually don't. So I think research can be a foundational block to stand on, but what beyond that we need is, it's important to build the political coalitions in different contexts, national and global movements for change, where members of that coalition can find what's important for them in that movement, whether it's related to social justice or environmental justice, whether it's important for them or indeed for people that they care about, and where sustained advocacy and campaigning can be effective in the longer run. So just to summarize, research is useful, and I hope it's not heretical as head of a research agency, but it only gets you so far. It's all about politics and building coalitions for change in the long run.
I almost want to borrow your remark, Kumi, when you started, and I'm cautiously optimistic that given what we've gone through as a planet, and we actually have listened to research, I think, throughout this pandemic, and let's hope we can keep that momentum and keep on listening to what our researchers are telling us about climate and environment and social breakdown, and how we need to actually work, towards that. I'm going to have, 20 seconds for my quick reflections, Isabel, before I hand over to you. I know you've got some excellent questions up your sleeve for the panelists. Just to say, Kumi and I share a country, so we are both South African, and Kumi, my feeling as I was listening to you and to Muida and to Rhoda was really the importance of solidarity, and how we saw in our country, in South Africa, how solidarity amongst workers, businesses, ordinary citizens, teachers, lawyers, researchers actually, were necessary and needed for achieving that massive shift and to freedom and dignity and the well-being of all people in our country. And I think solidarity is the gem for me that I hold on to here as I hand over to you, Isabel.
Thank you, Nashma, and thanks to all the panelists. I would like to continue with Kumi. Kumi, you have been a really lifelong activist for social justice and leader of very important civil society organizations. What triggered you really to become an activist? And then how could ordinary citizens also become activists and shape a new eco-social contract that supports the implementation of SDGs?
Thank you for that question. Firstly, I think it's important that I say very humbly that people always say I've been an activist for so long and so on. Let me say that my first march that I took part at, I was 15 years old. It was about education. And my wisdom was to say, we want equality. But the younger kids at the back of the march were chanting, we want the color TV. So yes, I've been around for a long time, but getting the messaging right sometimes is not always right. And I think that's the big lesson of the moment that we're in. That in fact, this is a moment where we have to be willing to do what Amilcar Cabral, the leader of Guinea-Bissau, said during the anti-colonial struggle. He said we should tell no lies and claim no easy victories. And I will also evoke the words of Albert Einstein when he said, it's a definition of insanity to do the same thing over and over again, expecting to get different results. And if I'm brutally honest, when I reflect on my life as an activist, I think I tick that definition of doing the same thing over and over again, expecting to get different results. I'll leave it to each of you to reflect of whether that definition actually works for you. But in the moment that we are, to answer your question, how do we think about people's engagement? I think even the NGO movement must now stop, and even the trade union movement must stop and think about whether we got the narrative absolutely right. I think we have to break this notion that people are sitting out there waiting for leaders of NGOs, trade unions, and other civil society organizations to lead them. Actually, people are today taking action. Many of the most inspirational mobilizations that we are seeing is irrespective of formal organized civil society. That is not to say that formal organized civil society is not critically important and will always be. But if we're moving forward, we have to stop always talking about people and focusing on what people don't have rather than what people have. What I mean by that is often we focus on the disempowerment, we focus on what people are deprived of, the rights that they're deprived of, as we should do. But I want to suggest, and I will share with you all an image that I'm developing of rethinking how we see people and the power of people. So I play a game with me now and imagine 4 quadrants, right? And on one quadrant, on the left-hand side, I call this people's pathway to global justice, right? And if you can think about 4 capacities that human beings have: our autonomy, our creative participation, our wealth collectively, and our consumption patterns. And rather than putting people as in the periphery, let's put people at the center with this thinking and start saying people have power as. And I want to say in the area of harnessing people's autonomy, people have power as citizens and voters. People have powers as enforcers of transparency and accountability. People have powers as shapers of their own destiny through movements, NGOs, trade unions, and so on. People have power as volunteers to take action for the public good, as we saw during the pandemic when governments were not able to address the needs of the poor during the pandemic. It was that spirit of volunteerism that actually contributed significantly in many societies. Then when we're thinking about creative participation, that quadrant, right? People have power as custodians of ancient wisdom, as shapers of arts, of values, ethics, and belief. And importantly, people have power as makers of culture and all forms of art. And let me just say in passing that far too often, those of us involved in formal campaigns speak a language that is not understood by ordinary people. If we are going to succeed in ensuring that a post-COVID recovery intervention balances equity with sustainability, one of the challenges for all of us is to be able to speak in much more accessible ways, and using arts, culture, and so on to communicate is going to be important. I'll just quickly say that the other 2 quadrants are harnessing our wealth, and yeah, people have power as owners of capital and assets. Maybe not that much than our enemies, but there is. But people have power as holders of bank accounts, and we need to start thinking about that as a power and how we collectivize that. People also have powers as holders of insurance policies and other products. We need to become smarter at leveraging this. And the last quadrant is harnessing our consumption power. People have power as consumers of energy, food, and everything else, and they also have power as consumers of information and disinformation. So let me just end by saying that there are new ways of thinking about how people can participate, people's assemblies, and so on. We need to recognize that the current form of participation is not ideal. I would go so far as saying that in far too many countries today, we have the form of democracy without the substance of democracy. And that is why a massive citizen engagement and participation is critical for any campaign for a more just, inclusive, and new social contract. And we need to be willing to recognize that the tools and the strategies that we've been using up to now is not adequate. And we must be open to listening to young people, to indigenous peoples, to musicians, to football players, and other influencers who seem to have capability to reach people. And we must have the humility to be able to engage with new kinds of suspects, not only the usual suspects that have populated these kinds of conversations in the past. Thank you.
Thank you, Kumi. I think, this recommendation is allowing us to come to our next speaker, to Moeda, and ask her, she's a young indigenous leader, and she has been part of the OHCHR fellowship that kind of brings indigenous and minority leaders from around the world together and connects them into an international movement and network. Moira, how do you see the role of international or regional networks, such as the Indigenous Peoples Youth Network, in advocating for and shaping a new ecosocial contract?
So what I see that now, like as I mentioned earlier, that now the state did not recognize us, like the indigenous people. One thing that I can see that the international organization or international network should pressure or advocate to the state to accept us, that to accept and recognize us as the indigenous people. Because as I told you earlier, that how it's challenge for us if the law, if the government, if the state not recognize us. And the second one, I think that now international law is still helpful and useful for us. Like based on my experience, when I faced with, I am a former legislative person. So at that time, the Thai government ratified and signed the CRC, or Convention on the Child Rights, Convention on the Right of the Child. So that is very helpful, because one article in the CRC mentioned about the right to citizenship or right to nationality. So after the government recognized that in Thailand we have the stateless person, so they changed the law, they changed the policy, except us. So now this one is now the situation better, because the law and policy open for the people, apply legal status or apply the Thai citizens. This is one example. I think that the international law is still important. And as I am a senior fellow on the indigenous people and the minority people, I think there's one solution that I call, I build a space and make the voice of the indigenous people heard. And I also, that because of a part of the program of the minority program in Geneva, that I feel comfortable and confident to communicate with SR or special rapporteur and use the international mechanism. So the whole week of this week is make my heart broken and my heart is crying, because of the state try to negotiate, move the indigenous people out from the national park. So I think that the international community that still should support us, that how to campaign and advocate to help us, that on the indigenous people are human. I think that if the government accept and recognize us as the human, the solution, we have a solution to respect of the indigenous people rights.
Thank you so much, Moira. And I would like to move on to Rhoda. Rhoda, you know, the COVID crisis has really exposed the inequalities that exist between capital and labor. What kind of transformation would you expect from a new eco-social contract?
Right, thank you very much, Isabella. And just to perhaps make the point that labor has always been, I mean, the relations between capital and labor has always been exploitative. I mean, for as long as we would recall, there's been always benefits or advantages and profits have always been in favor of what to capital. It's just the current, it's just how the structure, the economic structure is, the current economic structure, which is the neoliberal paradigm, somehow is just characterized by imbalanced relations between capital and labor. But what we've seen over the years, and now actually what COVID has also made more apparent, is the fact that it's just bringing to bear the huge inequalities between capital and labor. And somehow what has been, we know that there's been a lot of unfavorable trade deals. There's a race to the bottom. But what COVID exposed, or what COVID brought out actually in the past year, was a disruption of in the global supply chains. And somehow I would say, speaking as an African and from the African perspective, somehow I feel this is actually, or this has been a wake-up call, and this is actually an opportunity in a way for Africa, for labor. And I give example because see, with a lot of disruptions of global supply chains, we saw that a lot of countries now, and I'm talking about African countries now, had to look inward to produce, which is actually not the case. For most African countries, we have very huge, there's a lot of imports coming in, but with the disruptions in global supply chains, we had to look inwards to see how we could produce. And this actually brought, or somehow also provided or produced opportunities for job creation. And we also saw a lot of innovation during this time of COVID, where we had a lot of young people within Africa actually coming up with innovative ways to produce PPEs and, you know, different forms of different equipments that were needed that couldn't otherwise be supplied or be imported as we used to. So the relations that have been imbalanced in the long for some time now, I think somehow there is the opportunity for us to revisit and redesign these kind of relations. And we're hoping that with a new social contract will actually help and place a bit of an advantage for labor to be able to design, you know, or to be able to come up or with more favorable deals that would actually be at the advantage of labor. And this is what we continue to push for in the whole question around designing or coming up with a new social contract, the need for inequalities to be bridged. And so looking at how capital would, looking at how we can now rebuild societies in a way that productivity would pay off for labor, and labor would actually get a fair share of what they put in. And so at the end of the day, I'm seeing, and I think that it's important what Kumi says at the beginning, that there's some optimism, but then it's also important that we don't become too excited, but then to capitalize and build on the momentum that we have now, to see how we can restructure things in the favor of less advantaged populations, and in this case, rebalancing the relations between capital and labor would be a good way, or would be a good thing looking at a new social contract.
Thank you, Rhoda. These are already some very good ideas, I think. And I would also like to ask Paul, you know, how do you see kind of what are the new elements of a new eco-social contract? And how could such a contract help us with SDG implementation?
Thanks. I mean, as you said at the beginning when you introduced the session, there have been lots of people and groups calling for a new social contract, from the UNSG to the World Economic Forum. And they probably mean different things when they're calling for that, let's be honest. And what's really important is typically is not what it's called, but really what's in it and how it's formed. As you know as well, in UNRISD, we are using this term ecological social contract, an eco-social contract for short. And we, in research institutes, we like to pin things down a bit because we find over time that phrases and terms are malleable and they get co-opted by others and they change their meaning. And we've seen that a little bit with the term transformation and transformative change. So it's really important what's in it and how it's formed. Let me set out, you know, what UNRISD thinks currently about this eco-social contract. And I think the first thing to say is that it's not one big contract, or even a contract in the sense that lawyers would understand it, even if some bits eventually would be concretized in legislation, whether related to labour rights or the environment. It's more a set of expectations and norms in the relationships between the governing and the governed. And as you said at the beginning, importantly on how economic activity is regulated. So that means the relationship between employers and workers, capital and labour, between economic activity, the environment, biodiversity and ecosystems, and really how the full set of economic, social, political, civil and cultural rights can be realised. For our part in UNRISD, we suggest 5 ways in which this new eco-social contract would be different from the old broken post-World War II social contracts in Europe and North America. And the first is that it's fully human rights based for every person. for every right. And old social contracts typically excluded people or relegated groups to a secondary role, whether that be the role of women or informal workers, ethnic, racial and religious minorities, migrants. So it would represent a move beyond employment-related social rights to the full set of human rights. Secondly, it needs to be grounded in a revisitation of a new fiscal contract that raises sufficient resources to pay for the services and things that people value in life, and does so in a fair way. And that necessarily entails national and international dimensions, particularly what we've seen in recent decades of tax evasion and avoidance, and basically many countries around the world struggling to raise the resources to pay for the basic goods and services for their people. Third, and as people have mentioned, it needs to fundamentally shift and restructure economies and societies to halt and reverse climate change and environmental destruction. So we can no longer go on pretending that our economic activity, our consumption, our production is completely delinked from the planet that we live on. And in fact, we are not in relationship with our planet, we are a part of our planet. Fourth, it needs to be built from the bottom up and appropriate to local context. That is, it needs to be informed by the perspective and views of people of all parts of the world. It needs to be informed by indigenous knowledge. It needs to be, it should remedy historical injustices and distribute the burden of tackling the climate crisis through socially just transitions. And lastly, and I don't think this has been mentioned, but it should recognize that past social contracts have been built on an unequal sexual contract. And a new eco-social contract would be based on a sexual contract where the activities of production and reproduction are shared equally between men and women. Now, as I said, that's necessarily a bottom-up process, one that's built on broad dialogue and contestation, probably built sector by sector and issue by issue. And we can see it happening around the world. We have signs in different countries, in different contexts, in different sectors where that contestation is going on. And a new eco-social contract like that would support and be consistent with the vision in the 2030 agenda for sustainable development. It would serve to reduce inequalities in all their dimensions, help us recover from COVID-19 in an equitable and transformative way, and also improve our resilience for shocks and crises that are yet to come.
Thank you, Paul. I think that is a kind of a few elements together with those outlined by the other panelists. And I think I would like to add also like a sixth element, you know. I think when we create these progressive alliances between science, policymakers and activists, we should really try to overcome this spirit of we against them of the old contract to a spirit of we are all united against COVID and climate change, you know, to kind of to emphasize the solidarity that's also necessary. So yeah, just to, in order to end this session, I would like to say that UNRISD is working together with the Green Economy Coalition to design and a research policy and advocacy network around the new eco-social contract. And that's really responsive to the pressing social and ecological challenges of our times, such as, you know, biodiversity loss, climate change and inequality. That the network will aim from the beginning to co-produce knowledge with indigenous peoples and minority groups, to build on traditional knowledge, not only with regard to social dialogue and consensus building, where I think we can learn a lot from indigenous communities, but also on the sustainable use and management of natural resources. And you are very, very warmly invited to join the network by contacting either the UNRISD One office or the Green Economy Coalition. Thank you very much for your interest, and thanks to all the panelists for your contributions.